In 1100, the city of London had a job called the ale conner. His only responsibility was to test the quality of ale sold in the city. His method was as follows. He would pour a sample of ale onto a wooden bench, sit down in it wearing leather trousers, and stay there for 30 minutes. If, after 30 minutes, his trousers stuck to the bench, the ale contained too much sugar, which meant the brewer had either added honey to mask the taste of spoiled grain, or the fermentation had gone wrong. The brewer was fined. If his trousers did not stick, the ale was declared fit for sale. That was the quality control system. A man in sticky pants. The fact that this job existed tells you everything about what eating and drinking in medieval England actually involved. And the fact that it was considered rigorous tells you even more. The drink itself was not what the word ale brings to mind today. Modern ale is filtered, hopped, pasteurized, temperature-controlled, and stored in sealed containers with standardized shelf lives measured in months. Medieval ale was none of those things. It was brewed from malted barley, sometimes oats, sometimes a combination, mixed with water and left to ferment in open wooden barrels. There were no hops. Hops would not become standard in English brewing until the 15th century, roughly 300 years later. Without hops, ale had no natural preservative. Its shelf life was approximately 3 days. On day 1, it was drinkable. On day 2, it was tolerable. On day 3, it was starting to sour. On day 4, it was actively turning, thickening, developing a film on the surface, giving off a smell that even by medieval standards was not encouraging. And on day 4, in most alehouses across England, it was still being served. Because throwing away a batch of ale meant throwing away income. And the alehouse operated on margins that made that decision impossible. To understand those margins, you have to understand who was brewing. The alewife, almost always a woman, was not running a business in the modern sense. She was supplementing a household income that depended on farming, trade, or day labor. She brewed in her kitchen with whatever grain she could afford. She sold from her door or window, signaling availability by hanging an ale stake, a pole with a bush attached, outside the house. When the batch was gone, the stake came down. When the next batch was ready, it went back up. There was no inventory management. There was no refrigeration. There was a barrel of ale, a window, and a neighborhood that was going to drink whatever came out of it. The scale of consumption was extraordinary by modern standards. Estimates vary, but most historians put average daily ale intake at somewhere between 1 and 2 gallons per person, per day. That sounds impossible until you consider the context. Ale was weaker than modern beer, roughly 2 to 3% alcohol, and it was the primary source of both hydration and calories for people doing heavy physical labor in an era without coffee, tea, juice, or safe drinking water. A laborer might consume a gallon of ale before noon and another by nightfall. This was not alcoholism. This was hydration. And at 2 gallons a day, even a small village required enormous quantities of ale. Hundreds of gallons per week, brewed batch by batch in household kitchens, sold before it turned, and replaced the moment the barrel ran dry. The entire system depended on constant production. There was no stockpile. There was no reserve. There was this week's batch. And if the grain was bad, or the water was contaminated, or the alewife was ill, there was nothing. The fragility of the supply was invisible as long as it held. When it failed, entire neighborhoods went thirsty. But here's the part most people miss when they talk about medieval ale. The reason everyone drank it, adults, workers, even people who could taste that it had turned, was not because they loved it. It was because the alternative was water. And the water was worse. Much worse. In a country with no concept of water purification, no understanding of bacterial contamination, and no sewage infrastructure separating waste from drinking supply, untreated water was genuinely dangerous. People didn't avoid water out of ignorance. They avoided it out of experience. Generations of experience. Families knew, without understanding the microbiology, that people who drank water got sick more often than people who drank ale. The brewing process, primitive as it was, involved boiling the water. Boiling killed some of the bacteria, not all, but enough. Ale was safer than water. Not safe, safer. And in the 1100s, safer was the best anyone could hope for. The bread was worse than the ale. Not in taste, although accounts suggest the taste was grim, but in what it did to your body over time. Bread in the 1100s was made from coarsely ground grain, usually rye or a mixture of rye and barley. Wheat bread existed, but it was expensive, reserved for wealthier households and special occasions. The grinding process used stone querns or hand mills, and the stones shed grit into the flour. Not occasionally, consistently. Every loaf of bread contained microcyte fragments of quern stone, tiny pieces of rock baked into the dough. Every bite wore down the enamel. Dental examinations of medieval skeletons tell a consistent story. Teeth ground flat by the age of 30. Abscesses, infections, bone loss in the jaw. The bread was not just food. It was, very slowly, destroying the mouth of everyone who ate it. And everyone ate it. Every day. Because bread was the caloric foundation of the medieval diet, there was no substitute. And then there was ergot. Rye, the most common grain for bread in this period, was susceptible to a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. Ergot. It grew on the grain in wet seasons, turning the kernels dark and slightly swollen. In small amounts, it caused nausea, cramping, and a burning sensation in the limbs. In larger amounts, which happened during bad harvests, when contaminated grain was ground into flour without sorting, it caused convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene of the extremities, and death. Outbreaks of ergotism were recorded across medieval Europe. They were called St. Anthony's fire. Nobody understood the cause. The grain looked slightly different, but not different enough to discard when the harvest was poor and the alternative was starvation. Which, by the way, is the kind of choice that sounds simple from 8 centuries away and was anything but simple when you were the one standing in the granary trying to decide. The third item on the menu, and in most alehouses the last, was pottage. Pottage was a thick soup or stew made from whatever vegetables were available. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, herbs, and sometimes a small amount of salted meat if the household could afford it. It was cooked in a pot over an open fire, often for hours, and it was eaten warm. Of the 3 staples, ale, bread, pottage, it was probably the safest. The extended cooking killed most bacteria. The ingredients, when fresh, were relatively benign. Pottage was simple, bland, and monotonous, but it was unlikely to actively poison anyone. The problem with pottage was not what it contained. It was that it was the same thing every single day. Imagine sitting down to the same 3 items for every meal. Not for a week, not for a month, for an entire life. Breakfast, if there was breakfast, was bread and ale. Dinner, The main meal, eaten around noon, was bread, ale, and pottage. Supper, if it happened at all, was bread and ale again. That was the menu. 3 items, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Year after year after year. The concept of choosing what to eat did not exist at this level of society. The question was never, what sounds good? The question was, is there enough? Now, here's where it gets interesting. The system that produced this food had almost no oversight. The alewife, typically a woman, often the wife of a tradesman or farmer, brewed ale in her home and sold it from her front door or window. There was no license in the modern sense. There was no health inspection. The assize of bread and ale, first formalized in 1266, set standards for the weight of a loaf relative to the price of grain and the volume of ale relative to its price. It did not regulate ingredients. It did not regulate cleanliness. It did not require that the brewing water be fresh or that the grain be free of fungus. It regulated the transaction, how much you got for your money, not the product. If the loaf was the correct weight, it was legal. If the ale was the correct volume, it was legal. What was in either one was nobody's concern. The ale conner checked for sugar content. Nobody checked for contamination. Nobody checked because the concept of contamination, in the microbial sense, did not exist. The alehouse itself was not a dedicated building. It was someone's home with the front room cleared for drinking. The ceiling was low, 6 feet, sometimes less. The floor was packed earth or rough stone, covered with rushes that absorbed spilled ale, food scraps, and whatever the patrons tracked in from the street. There were no separate tables. There were benches along the walls. The light came from tallow candles, animal fat wicks that produced a dim, smoky, foul-smelling glow, and from the cooking fire. Ventilation was minimal. The smoke from the fire mixed with the tallow smoke and the steam from the brewing barrel and the breath of a dozen people in a room designed for 4. Somebody actually tried to reconstruct the atmosphere of a medieval alehouse in the 1980s, a historical experiment in a replica building. The researchers noted that visibility dropped to about 10 feet within an hour of lighting the fire. That was the dining room. That was where you sat down to eat. 2 hours after sitting down in an 1100s alehouse, a modern body would begin registering the experience. The ale, particularly if it was past its 3rd day, would introduce a cocktail of wild yeasts and bacteria that a stomach accustomed to pasteurized, filtered beverages has no framework for handling. Cramps would be the first signal, then nausea. Not dramatic, not incapacitating, just a low hum of discomfort that a medieval person would not even register as unusual. The bread would be depositing stone grit between the teeth, beginning the slow erosion that would leave the average person chewing on exposed nerves by 30. And if the rye contained even trace amounts of ergot, the first symptoms would be starting. Mild nausea, a strange tingling in the fingers, a warmth in the limbs that had nothing to do with the fire. The pottage would likely be fine, the one mercy of the meal. But the cumulative effect, repeated daily over months and years, was what defined medieval health. Not one catastrophic event, not a single poisoned meal. A slow, invisible accumulation of low-grade damage that shortened lives, weakened immune systems, and left every body in the country vulnerable to whatever infection came next. Which is exactly the population the plague would find 2 centuries later when it arrived in a country already weakened by generations of eating and drinking exactly this way. Here's the thing that changes the picture entirely. This was not a broken system. This was the system. The alewife was not cutting corners. She was operating exactly as her mother had, and her grandmother before that. The baker was not negligent, Stone grit in flour was a physical consequence of the only milling technology available. The ale conner was not incompetent. He was applying the most sophisticated quality test his civilization had developed. Every person in this chain was doing their job. The problem was not laziness or malice or stupidity. The problem was the absence of knowledge that would not arrive for centuries. The microbiology, the food science, the public health infrastructure. All of it was coming. None of it was here. And the people sitting in that alehouse, eating that bread, drinking that ale, had no reason to believe anything was wrong. Because by every measure available to them, nothing was. If you had walked in and told them the bread was destroying their teeth, they would have stared at you. Everyone's teeth looked like that. That was the meal. Ale that was turning. Bread that was grinding down the teeth. Pottage that was, if nothing else, warm and filling. 3 items. No menu, no choice. No complaint, because there was nothing to compare it to. The alehouses of 1100 England were not the cheerful taverns of fantasy, not the warm golden glow of a Hollywood inn where a barmaid slides you a foaming pint. They were dark, smoky, low-ceilinged rooms where people ate what was available because the only alternative was not eating. And they went back every day. Because the alehouse was also the social center, the news hub, the meeting place, and the warmest room most people would sit in all week. It was all of those things, and none of them were safe. And nobody could have told them otherwise. Nobody knew. Medieval food was dangerous. But there was a place in the 1800s where the food was a luxury, a genuine improvement over what most people ate at home. The problem was everything else. The work, the weather, the isolation, the disease. Next time, we're leaving England entirely. We're heading to the American frontier to look at life as an 1800s cowboy. And almost everything most people think they know about cowboys comes from a novel written by a man who never went west of Philadelphia.